Okay, thank you, guys. We're going to start now. I think everyone that, 1 second, sorry, I'll just admit a few more people. Okay. Thank you for coming, everyone, to our second panel session within the accounting discipline group for the year. And this one is unlocking labour mobility, non-compete clauses and their future in Australia. It's a great topic. We have an even greater panel. Before I pass on to our host, Hayley, I will read acknowledgement country first. I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, upon whose ancestral lands our city campus now stands. I would like to pay respect to the elders, both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land. Okay, I will pass you on to Hayley. She will introduce the panel and start the process. Thank you, Hayley.
Thanks, Roman. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today. Labor mobility is a driving force behind innovation and economic growth, but it also brings complex challenges, especially when it comes to balancing the interests of employees, businesses, and society at large. And the non-compete agreements play a very important role in this dynamic. On one hand, it allows employers to protect their intellectual property and encourage business investment. But on the other hand, it can also pose a barrier for workers to develop their careers and also knowledge spillover. So today we are privileged to have a distinguished panel of experts who bring diverse perspectives to this discussion. So first, joining us online, we have the Honorable Dr. Andrew Leigh, MP, Assistant Minister for Competition, Charities and the Treasury, and also for Employment. Thank you, Andrew, for joining us today online. Joining the panel are Professor Joellen Martin from UTS Law School, leading expert in employment contracts and labor law, Dr. Michael Falk, Chief Economist of IP Australia, who is leading the Chief Economist Program of Economic Research, Advice and Publications. Last but not least, Professor Peter Fleming from UTS Business School, an internationally recognized researcher on the future of work and its ethical implications. Through today's discussion, we hope to explore how Australia can unlock the full potential of labor mobility while balancing diverse interests, particularly in the light of the government's ongoing competition review on this issue. And we invite the audience to actively engage with our conversation today. Feel free to submit your questions through the QR code displayed on the screen. Without further ado, let's welcome Assistant Minister Andrew Leigh to deliver the keynote address, sharing his insights into the government's current work on non-compete agreements reforms.
Well, thanks very much, Hayley. It's great to be with you. I left academia for politics 14 years ago, but it's lovely to have the chance to play a professor on the UTS stage every now and then. I've done a lot of collaboration with UTS, and so it's great to be with you virtually today. I'm joining you from Ngunnawal lands, so as Roman acknowledged the traditional owners on which you're meeting, let me acknowledge the traditional owners here: Darranunna, Darranunawal, Yungu, Nalamanyan, Dunimanyan, Ngunnawalwari, Dowdawari, Dindi, Wangarlin, Jenyen. I acknowledge too all First Nations people present. Hayley, thank you to you for your leadership in bringing together what I think is a really important conversation about a deeply understudied issue, which is the constraints on workers moving to a better job. When I first got interested in this topic a couple of years ago, pretty much everyone I spoke to said, look, this is really just an American problem. The Americans have gone a bit crazy with non-compete clauses, and now 1 in 5 of their workers have a non-compete in their employment agreements. But it's not really an issue here, except for tech workers where there's perfectly reasonable rationale for them. So we sought to investigate that claim. In partnership with the E61 think tank, Dan Andrews led a survey which was supported by the Susan McKinnon Foundation and looked for the first time at the prevalence of non-competes in Australia. That was a survey of employees, which found in Australia, 1 in 5 Australians had a non-compete agreement. Now, the figure, when you look at the precise percentage, is actually a smidgen higher in Australia than in the United States. We then got the Australian Bureau of Statistics to come at the question another way, to include in their employee earnings and hours survey, their survey of employers, questions around restrictions on labour mobility. And while that question doesn't break down as neatly onto the share of workers, the analysis of it that's been done suggests that it's producing a similar result, around 1 in 5 workers bound by non-competes. Who are these workers? Well, they're not all high-tech workers. We've conducted, through the Competition Task Force in Treasury, we've gone out and done deep dive consultations, and that has revealed a whole lot of industries where non-compete clauses are rife. We have early childhood workers unable to move to a better job and might be closer to home because they have non-compete clauses in their agreements. We have hairdressers unable to shift salons, yoga instructors who are unable to move to another salon. Some of the consultation threw up really distressing stories. There was an account of a woman who had been sexually harassed, but told that if she tried to move to another firm, that the non-compete clause would be levied against her. We had a 19-year-old minimum wage worker taken to court for a breach of a non-compete clause. These sorts of egregious examples illustrate the extent to which non-compete clauses have become rife across the economy. Lawyers typically draft standard form employment agreements, and so very often an employment agreement isn't a new contract devised by the parties for the first time. It's a boilerplate which the employer takes off the shelf. And including a non-compete clause has become costless for employers. Why wouldn't you do it? Employees don't typically complain about them because, just as the typical couple at the altar doesn't negotiate over a prenup, the typical worker starting a new job doesn't want to negotiate over the circumstances under which they might leave that job. Negotiating a non-compete is seen as a bit gauche. It's a bit embarrassing. It's a signal that you're not a stayer at the firm. And so workers don't negotiate on them and get stuck with them. We've also seen the phenomenon of cascading clauses, which might say that you are prevented from working a job anywhere within 50 kilometres of UTS for a year. Or if that's invalid, then 30 kilometres. And if that's invalid, then 10 kilometres. And if if a 1-year constraint is invalid, then 6 months. And if that's invalid, then 3 months. The consequence is, with these cascading clauses, that the employee has no idea what will actually bind them. And the only way of testing that is to go to court. And the cost of going to court is hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, we know that the impact of non-competes is considerable on constraining worker mobility. Studies in the United States, led by Evan Starr and co-author Evan Starr and JJ Prescott, who were very helpful to us as we were devising the Australian surveys, suggest that there is a significantly lower rate of labour mobility. Why does this matter? Well, moving from one job to another typically produces the biggest wage gains over the course of a career. Just ask yourself, going back through your career, when you've got the biggest wage bump. Chances are it wasn't the same employer giving you a pay rise, it was shifting to a different employer and getting a higher paying job. So non-compete clauses may well be dampening down wages. The research that the US Federal Trade Commission has done suggests that US workers are being hurt to the tune of around $500 a year. The work that the Competition Task Force has done in Australia comes up with a similar number, around $500 a year. That's across the entire workforce. So that means for the affected workers, we're looking at a number in the thousands of dollars. This is because constraining workers from moving to a better job means fewer people get a better job. But there's another pernicious impact of non-competes, which is on startups. If you're looking to start a new firm in a full employment economy, you're not likely to be hiring all of your workers off the unemployment queues. More likely, you're going to be looking to hire workers from competing firms. But if all of those workers are locked up with non-compete clauses, it's going to be harder for you to start your firm. Non-compete clauses lock in monopolies and lock out startups. They make it more difficult for new firms to get a foothold in an industry. Those new firms are a big source of productivity growth for the economy. So the expansion of non-compete clauses may well be dampening down the economy, reducing economic dynamism and reducing productivity. Non-compete clauses aren't just bad for wages, they're bad for national productivity as well. Where have non-compete clauses been constrained? Well, the very best example is California, which has banned non-compete clauses since the 1800s. South California, of course, is home to Silicon Valley, one of the most innovative places on the planet. This is an example that really gives the lie to the notion that constraining the use of non-competes would somehow cause problems for technologically advanced firms to work through. And indeed, we have lovely historical examples. The so-called traitorous eight who left Shockley Semiconductors in the 1960s went on to start a whole range of prosperous firms in the Valley, including Intel. Had they not been able to walk out on a boss who was, by every definition, a bad boss, they might not have engaged in that surge of productivity that was so useful for California, Silicon Valley, and the world at large. So we're looking at a range of different approaches on non-competes, guided by what's being done in other countries. There are some countries that require non-competes to be compensated. So in Finland, for example, you need to compensate, I think it's up to about 40%, at least 40% of the worker's wage. In the United States, they've gone for a blanket ban on non-competes with the Federal Trade Commission in March announcing that policy. It is, as you'd expect in a country like the United States, being challenged in the courts. We'll see where it finally lands. But it is very clear when you look at the United States that concern about non-competes isn't just a Democratic issue. It is also an issue that is concerning Republicans. One way of regarding non-competes is that it's an issue of workers' rights, an issue where you might imagine that it's going to mobilise the left. But another way of thinking about non-competes is that it's an issue of freedom, that a worker should have the freedom to walk out and join another firm the next day. And the non-competes are a constraint on freedom. And in that sense, the constraining the growth of non-competes should be an issue for the right as well. We've done extensive consultation with an issues paper put out in April and a whole range of engagement coming back. We'll be announcing the way forward on non-competes in the not too distant future. And we've really valued the academic expertise that's been brought to bear on this question. It's important to get this right on a legal side, but it's also important to remember that we need to think about the practical effects of non-competes. Right now, unenforceable non-compete clauses are having a chilling effect. That's because the fact that you can get a non-compete overturned in the court isn't good enough for workers who can't afford to go to court. The easier option typically is simply to wait out the non-compete period rather than pay for expensive litigation. So having clearer rules around non-competes would provide guidance to employees and would recognise that we need a system that allows employers and employees to better understand the circumstances in which non-competes can and can't be used. There are other ways of protecting confidential information. Theft is illegal, including theft of intellectual property. The constraints on employees soliciting from workers or clients from the firms are different from constraints on the mobility itself. And in my read of the research, have less of a chilling effect. So certainly for firms who say they're IT heavy, that they've got a lot of intellectual property, the non-compete is the bluntest tool in the shed. it's not the only way of protecting that important intellectual property, which is so vital for many Australian firms in the tech industry and beyond. I wish you well for the discussions today. I've got two of my staff online, Tori Barker and Francis Kitt. We'll do our best to stay for as much of it as we can and look forward very much to the results of your deliberation. Thanks again.
Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your insights on the government's current review into this important issue. Now we'll move into the panel discussion. So to begin, I would like to have a look at the current legal landscape of non-compete agreements in Australia. So Joellen, your academic work has closely tracked the legal developments in this space. So can you give us an overview of the current framework and your thoughts on its adequacy?
Do you want me to use this?
Yes. Just need to.
It's already on? No? It's already on. It's on now. Okay. Now this is where, what do I press to make the slides work? Just like that? This or that one? Okay, the legal landscape. Okay, I'm the lawyer. My job is to just explain to you how our legal system created this problem. Many of you will have studied some contract law, so apologies if this is very basic, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. We all know that our system of laws enforces contracts as agreements between, voluntarily made agreements between people. But one of the things that we need to remember is that even that contract doctrine historically would not enforce contracts that were against the public interest. And so typically, 400 years ago, masters, blacksmiths working in villages who would take on apprentices would not be able to enforce any promises that they squeezed out of the apprentice, that the apprentice would not compete once they'd acquired their full trade qualification. That kind of contractual agreement was considered to be an illegal restraint on trade for the two kinds of interests that Dr. Lee mentioned. First of all, the interest in freely competitive markets. We all benefit from there being competition in markets, and also the interest in the freedom of individuals to continue to support themselves. It's better for the whole of society if everyone can make their own living. Now, that's one principle, that not all contract clauses were enforceable, and certainly restrictions on free trade were unenforceable in the past. The other principle of contract law is that contracts are not enforced by injunctions, that is, by orders that people must do what they promised. Contract law in its wisdom says that the way you remedy a breach of contract is by making the person who broke the contract pay damages. And then it's incumbent upon the person who's lost something from the bargain to show what they've lost, and they can be compensated for it. So there's your two principles that have actually been quite sturdy in our commercial law for a very long time. But they've been eroded over time in this specific area of employment contract law. Now, the first source of erosion was this case, Nordenfeld's case back in 1894, when an international arms dealer sold his business for what would today be hundreds of millions, possibly £1 billion, and as part of the deal agreed not to compete with the buyer for 20 years. So the price he paid was for the goodwill of the business. What happened there? Then, of course, Nordenfeld decides he will compete straight away and relies on the fact that under the law at the time, these clauses were unenforceable. The buyer goes to court and gets a new principle established. Restraints can be enforceable so long as they go no further than is necessary to protect a legitimate business interest. So there's your first erosion of that, the illegality principle. Your second one came a bit earlier in a case called Lumley and Wagner about a niece of Wagner, the great musician, who was an opera singer. Her agent had signed a contract for her to have a 3-month season at Her Majesty's Theatre. And during the time she was contracted to Her Majesty's, she got a very coveted invitation to sing at Covent Garden, which she naturally wanted to take. Her Majesty's theatre owner managed to get an injunction stopping her from singing at Covent Garden. Now, couldn't get an order making her sing, but could get an order that she not sing at Covent Garden. It was only a contract that was the whole contract only lasted for 3 months, and it was only for the remaining weeks of the contract that she was injuncted. But that case has been one of the, I would say, most perniciously influential cases in employment law, because ever since then, even though the normal rule is only damages for breach of contract, you can get an injunction stopping people from doing something that they promised not to do. And so what does that mean for our law now after, several decades of gradual development of these principles? We have the situation that Dr. Lee has explained already, a restrictive covenant, even in an employment contract, not just a sale of business where you've actually been paid a price for your promise, but just an ordinary employment contract can be enforced, and it can be enforced by an injunction. A lot of those are obtained as interlocutory injunctions. That is a quick and dirty application to the court with not proper argument, where the court will just grant the injunction so long as they're persuaded there's a serious question to be tried and the balance of convenience favours the granting of the injunction. And I can tell you, in most cases, courts are happy to decide the balance of convenience in favour of the employer's argument. The employer need only show they've got a legitimate interest they're protecting. And these days, that's confidential information. It used to be trade secrets and, really serious IP types of protections. But now some kind of confidential information. One of the supermarket chains managed to persuade people that the way they arranged the products on the shelves was confidential information. I would have thought it was obvious to anyone who went into the store, and that was a large section of the public. But never mind, that kind of information is now considered to be confidential. Customer connection, the fact that your employees are the face of your business and deal directly with the customers, that customer connection is something that is seen to belong to the employer. A lot of restraints are about that. The worst one, I think, is the most recent to develop, and I think it's really only developing in Australia, is the notion that an employer has an interest in maintaining a stable workforce so that they can get an injunction stopping one person who leaves from inviting other people they've worked with to come and join them. So the notion of a legitimate interest has expanded. The other thing the employer will need to show is that the restraint is no more than reasonable to protect that interest, and that usually devolves around considerations of territory, how far and wide can you be restrained and for how long. But even those restraints have grown over time. When I first started teaching employment law about 20 years ago, it was common for me to say, look, a customer connection constraint can usually only last for about 8 or 12 weeks, because in that amount of time, an employer's got plenty of chance to contact their customers and say somebody new is going to be servicing your account. But now I've seen those kinds of ones go on for 6 months, a year, even 2 years in the case of financial advice. So they're incredibly long restraints. And again, a very insidious thing is that in this country particularly, there's no requirement to actually prove any damage. There is, in fact, a case decided about 15 years ago now in New South Wales where the judge said it is not an obstacle to getting a restraint, that the restraint will cause serious hardship to the employee without providing any benefit to the employer. Now, that, funnily enough, I was interested to hear Dr. Lee say that this was more of a problem in the United States than here for some time. My understanding is that always in the United States, you at least had to prove, to get an injunction, you at least had to prove serious risk of damage. whereas that has lost its potency as an element in Australia. So I, as a lawyer looking at this area, would say that review is seriously overdue. There has been a creeping change over the last, 150 years, and particularly escalating in New South Wales, where we have legislation that basically presumes restraints are okay and gives courts permission to read them down to help employers out if employers have done a sloppy job of drafting them. We really do need review because they are being used against hairdressers, cleaners, house cleaners, people who don't earn an awful lot of money and who's really the reason why they're able to go off and start their own business is because their own personal skills and talents is what they're taking with them. They're not taking any kind of confidential information or IP from an employer. They're just wanting to make a better life for themselves, and we should not be supporting a system of law that interferes with that freedom, particularly when, again, I agree entirely with Dr. Lee, our court system is ridiculously expensive and is not a venue at all available to the ordinary worker to pursue their claims. Shall I pass this on? Oh, I suppose I should just say that that last slide that I had up there also confirms exactly what Dr. Lee has said. These are standard form, boilerplate clauses. Nobody reads them. A lot of people get given their employment contract after they've started. HR finally gets around to sending you the contract and you sign it and send it back, goes in the bottom drawer for 20 years. Nobody, even the employer doesn't know what's in it until such time as there is an argument, and those clauses are discovered with great glee by the bad employer who wants to punish someone for leaving.
Thank you, Joellen, for sharing your insights into the legal issues. So I would like to bring Michael and Peter into the discussion. So as some fundamental principle, do you think should employees have the freedom to choose where to use and develop their skills?
So thank you for the invitation to join this conversation. Look, I think as a question of freedom and the kind of ethics of around that, I'll leave that to Peter. But let me say that the providing the conditions where employees have choice to carve career paths that are going to put their talents to the most productive use is really critical to economic prosperity and productivity in the long run. And those conditions depend on having a competitive labour market where you have many employers seeking labour services, many employees seeking new jobs. They have the choice to try and satisfy their preferences, and that's going to result in better matches, better job satisfaction, and there are corollary benefits as you go down the line. We can discuss those later. Freedom is also a question of the system that we create to ensure that resources and people's talents are allocated efficiently within the economy. And that's basically the economic perspective. And Peter can talk about the ethics and future of work.
Thank you for inviting me to participate as well. And I think I agree with everything that's been said. And I really welcome the review and congratulate Dr. Lee and his team for the work they're doing in this area. It's interesting to look at the US though, isn't it? Because I think if you want to see how bad work can get, and law has been at the forefront for the last 30 years, degradation of employment and jobs, you go to the US, at-will contracts, no strike clauses, arbitration waiver clauses, non-compete clauses. And so if you want to see a barometer, use the US as a barometer of where we don't want to go. at the moment. And I know that the FCC's attempts to outlaw these clauses has been hit hard by the Chamber of Commerce, I think it is. And with Trump coming into power, I doubt that it will actually pass. So I think that the status quo will be will prevail, unfortunately. But I think it's interesting. It's interesting. You know, this has clearly started off. The idea was about trade secrets. Fair enough. You know, firm-specific, transferable trade secrets. Sure, I can understand why an employer would want to not see that information walk out the door, but clearly it's been abused and it's being exploited for other purposes. And I think it's just power. It's to render the power relationship at the heart of the employment situation in the favor of the employer. And this is a pretext, I guess, for that, which depresses wages, has important implications for freedom. And one of the big definitions of freedom in our society is exit options, right? That we know we can leave. And if we can't, then that's a major impingement on our freedom. Unfortunately, these questions have been removed from the economic domain. You know, it's all about efficiency, economics, you know, and these important ethical questions have been put elsewhere. We don't talk about them in relation to our work, which I think needs to change as well. And I see this initiative as a really important really important initiative for that objective. I would be interested, given the Chamber of Commerce and the big backlash in the US against this among employers, what is the situation? I'm not too sure. Has there been a backlash against this initiative among Australian employers? Does anyone know what the views of we're talking about the employee, what about the employer? How are they feeling about this? I'd be interested to know.
Yes, so definitely it's interesting to hear the perspective from the employers as well. So there are arguments supporting the use of non-compete. So the arguments are like they do provide protection for businesses over intellectual property, customer relationships, and it also gives businesses an potential incentive to make investment into talents and innovation, knowing that they will get a return from those investments. So I just want to ask Andrew, during the government's consultation, did business or employer groups express similar concerns about any potential restrictions or ban on non-compete?
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly had a range of firms which have raised issues here. One of the challenges is the political economy dynamics of this, which is that the group that is not represented is people who would like to start up a firm but are unable to do so because of non-competes. So the existing peak bodies represent the largest firms. They're strong voices in the room, but it's important for us as a government to be reflecting the fact that we need to be focused on the startups that don't yet exist, as well as the monopolies that do. And we've also seen a sort of willingness to engage, and I don't think anyone pushes back and says, no, it's really critical we have non-competes for security guards. So the egregious expansion that a range of the panelists have referred to, you know, that's clearly gone too far in everyone's views.
Yeah. So Joellen, so how would you respond to these kind of concerns? Are there any other legal mechanisms employers can use that can effectively replace the role of non-compete?
Well, the first thing you can do is have a reasonable termination clause requiring an employee to give a certain amount of notice. And you can hold people to their notice period, because while someone's on their notice period, remember they're still receiving their salary. So long as those notice periods don't also become illegally long, that's a way of making sure that an employer has noticed that an employee is going to leave and has time to adjust their plans accordingly, particularly in respect of customer relationships and those things. We have a broad range of intellectual property laws that have been mentioned already. Any copyright information can be protected, trademarks can be protected, passing off laws protect business reputation from people pretending that they're your business when they're not. You can register a patent over an invention. You can register designs. They're all very definite intellectual property laws, and you could stop someone from abusing those laws without stopping them from going and working for someone else. So there's a range of laws that do protect businesses' property interests in legitimate ways, or ways that we've decided are legitimate. There's all sorts of arguments about how broad our IP laws are too, really. But these are all methods that don't stop a person from going and earning a living. Remember that what a restrictive covenant does, enforced by injunction, it makes someone go and sit on their hands and not earn a living for a long period of time. A lot of people, they just can't take that risk, so then they can't take the new job.
So if we look at the broader economic implications, so non-compete clauses would have the potential to significantly affect labor mobility, business investment, and productivity. So I guess the key question is, do non-compete clauses stimulate or hold back innovation and performance? And Michael, I know you've done research in this space. Can you tell us a little bit about your work and the general research findings on the economic impact of non-compete? You can just present here. Yeah, so if we can have the slides share on the screen.
My last.
Yeah, so maybe. Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, let me help to frame up some of the thinking about the economic impacts of non-competes, particularly in relation to innovation, with an underlying kind of interest in management of intellectual property and the sort of drivers of innovation. And I think it is worth thinking first about the economic case for non-competes and the evidence in that direction. And that is essentially to solve a hold-up problem where firms want to share vital knowledge with their employees, who may then take that knowledge and divulge it, or threaten to divulge it if they're not additionally compensated. And if firms are unwilling to share that knowledge, that can reduce the efficiency of their operations, but it may also devalue the knowledge to the extent that they're not willing to invest in creating it or adopting it in the first place. And so there is some evidence that non-competes or the enforceability of non-competes increases investment in research and development, in worker training, in capital equipment. It's contextual and the evidence is quite mixed. But it also raises questions about, are these the optimal instruments, given there are alternatives for achieving those same ends, take into account the harms and how they're weighed against benefits. And I think what the evidence points to is that non-competes do increase investment, but through their impact on competition and access to knowledge inputs, that investment may be less effective toward driving innovation. So in thinking about the harms of non-competes, they all stem back from the impact of their impact on competition in the labor market. Again, you want many employers and employees seeking jobs in the market so that they can be efficiently matched. And there is evidence, as Andrew pointed out, that non-competes tend to reduce labor mobility in the market, inhibiting efficient matching. So some employers may choose not to enter the workforce but others may take a job at which they're less productive. And these kind of career detours mean that they're not maximally applying their talents to productive ends. As Andrew noted, this can have the corollary effect of suppressing earnings in the market, in the labor market, and using, so researchers from the US have used basically variation and change across states in the extent to which non-competes are enforceable to look at these effects, and found that that non-competes tend to suppress earnings, particularly for women and non-white employees who are maybe more risk adverse in leaving jobs under these constraints. So I'll skip this. So of course, one of the sort of key cases where it matters if employees don't leave their jobs or end up on sort of career detours is if they have entrepreneurial potential. And we, from the economic literature, we know that employees leaving existing jobs with established firms to set up new enterprise, often innovating to sort of service markets that are ignored by existing market players. This is a key driver of innovation, of the growth of clusters where there are high growth firms and industrial progress and change. And so these studies from the US estimate that the enforceability of non-competes tends to reduce the firm entry rate, or the rate at which businesses are formed. But not only that, but they can tend to give incumbent firms or existing market players superior access to the talent that you need for a new venture to really thrive and grow. And to put this into perspective, within Australia, my team's been looking at basically wages and labour movement in firms that are granted their first patent. And this is using very large linked employer-employee data, covering 11 million individuals in Australia, tracking their employment across 1.1 million firms, and really looking at the wage response to the firm patent grant for different groups of workers and labour mobility at that critical juncture in a firm's growth. And what we find is that there's a significant wage premium that accrues not just to high skill workers, your inventors, your managers, your founders, but also a significant wage premium, in fact, twice as large, for lower skill level workers, those who may include sort of marketers or technicians who require less formal education to perform competently in their roles, but may nonetheless be critical to commercializing innovations in the market, right? And so if we look at the kind of timing effects, what we find is that among high skill level workers, the largest wage premium accrues to those who have been with the firm 2 to 4 years prior to the patent grant. So you can think of this as those founders, those early joiners, capturing a return on their initial investment in forming and developing the business. But among low skill level workers, the largest wage premium accrues to new hires. And there's evidence there's an increased rate of after the grant bringing those workers into the firm. So the firm is engaging in some workforce upgrading where they're bringing on the doers who are going to help to commercialize those innovations and help to grow the firm. And so I think this really puts into context the arguments that Andrew touched on. Not only that it's really vital for entrepreneurship and innovation that firms have access to talent, but that talent spans across occupations and across different skill levels within the economy. Okay, so if we span out to sort of the broader impacts on innovation of non-competes, the sort of key mechanism here is the flow of knowledge and ideas across firms and how that can be curtailed if you limit labour mobility, right? So firms can learn by hiring, by bringing people into the firm, but also by the diaspora of their employees, the social ties that people who leave the firm maintain with their previous colleagues, as a channel by which the firm can learn about innovative activities happening elsewhere in the economy and access knowledge elsewhere. And so using that same linked employer-employee data, we've looked at how labour mobility relates to patenting within Australian firms, and found that for firms that have a high, compared to their employee base, many people who are new hires into the firm, they tend to patent more. And that's also, that's particularly the case if those employees have come from small patent holding firms where they may be less able to control the intellectual property that they have at hand. But they're also, those firms are important ideas factories within the economy. We also find that, that patenting increases when firms have a large proportion of their employee base who leave the firm, especially if they're leaving two small patent holding firms that are those kind of ideas generating centers within the economy. And this is sort of, you know, consistent with evidence from the US, which finds that non-competes tend to, or the enforceability of non-competes tends to reduce patenting rates across states, but also within publicly listed firms, that reducing the enforceability of non-competes may reduce investment in research and development, but also reduces the effectiveness of that investment by curtailing their access to work, to new workers with sort of bringing up new knowledge and ideas. Yeah, I'll stop there. There are, I think, considerations around the use of patenting data in these studies, and there are also implications for intellectual property policy that stem from removing non-competes, which maybe we can pick up in the discussion.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thanks, Michael, for sharing such interesting research findings with us. I think your research really highlight the importance of labor mobility, the impact for innovation, and the overall economic growth. So in this debate around the non-compete agreements, so lots of the debate focuses on the incentive for businesses to invest. It seems employers tend to be forgotten in this debate because it is the employers, it is their creativity, their expertise, and their willingness to create new ideas that will eventually lead to business innovation outcome and improve the performance. So I would like to ask the panel, so how do you think individual employees' incentive may be affected at work, like knowing their job mobility is constrained by non-compete agreements? Peter, any thoughts?
Well, I often speak to people who are contemplating leaving jobs, because usually it's at the point they're contemplating the first time they look at their contract. And also if they don't have a great relationship with the people that they're leaving, they've now got a sense that they'll have problems. And I think one of the things that people who are not well off enough to fight a restraint, or, you know, often they can't even necessarily afford to pay the $4,000 or $5,000 that you'd pay to just get initial legal advice on a contract claim like this. So what they'll do is think, oh, well, I'll just sort of sit around and I just will serve out my notice and not do very much and be relatively unproductive, reserve my best ideas for when I feel I am going to be free. So it doesn't, trapping people is not great for capturing that discretionary effort that actually makes most employees most valuable to firms. You know, most people are most productive because they give a lot more than the strict terms of their contract provides. And so I would say that in my experience of talking to people who discover that they're bound by these things, often their personal productivity will decline while they are contemplating how they're going to manage to exit a place that they don't want to be anymore before they can take a new life for themselves.
Yep.
I think certainly it's not going to be great for motivation. Having no exit options or little exit options in this way, keying into the quiet quitting and presenteeism kind of phenomenon that seems to have swept the landscape of modern employment quite pervasively. I think an important part of this debate, we need to kind of disaggregate the labour market. You know, not all jobs are the same. So I think that, for example, I was talking to someone who works in a bookshop who's got a non-compete clause, right? You're thinking, you know, so what incentive is there to do well at that job? Does it increase their training? Probably not. They would have received the same training, but experience. They taught themselves. There's a lot of self-teaching in many of these jobs, right? Rather than formal training from an employer. And that type of work compared to a very sophisticated high-tech job, I think they're very kind of different. And so we have to be quite careful that we just don't think of all jobs are the same. I can imagine that someone who's working in the defense industry with a very good income, highly skilled, wouldn't care too much signing a non-compete clause. You know, if they'll think to themselves, I'm going to be here for several years anyway, compared to someone working in the bookshop down the road on near minimum wage. They're very, very different kettle of fish, I do believe. So yeah, they might have. I often wonder, what about people with multiple jobs? We're also assuming that the workforce is made up with people with one job, but that's not the case for many, many workers. So in the context where I've got multiple jobs and I want to work for multiple bookshops selling books, what happens with these workers, right? Does it mean that they have to kind of really diversify? You know, I'll clean down at the hospital and sell books in the weekend or whatever. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind as well.
Yeah, so, you know, wages and earnings influence the incentive that individuals have to engage in the innovation process, and their capacity to innovate also relies on complementary investments that the firm will make in capital equipment, in training. So there are considerations on the two sides. One thing also to consider is the distributive impact of changes in non-competes. And, you know, some scholars point to, they suggest that it's really the reduction in earnings or the increase in earnings, the reduction in earnings from non-competes is really just a transfer. It's not a, so, you know, if there are enforceable non-competes, then employers will target their recruitment efforts at those who are unconstrained or unbound. And they'll have increased labor demand and may leverage that for higher earnings. But that relies on there being transparency around who has non-competes and who doesn't, which is just clearly not there. And, you know, so, you know, yeah, whether the conditions are in place for that. I think it's also the case that, you know, the uncertainty creates costs in the market, you know, increased recruitment and screening costs, increased search costs if you're looking for a new job. And that's just creates frictions that suppress earnings broadly across the market. And so, you know, yeah, the earnings matter and they appear to be across the market generally. Yeah.
So I think the comments from the panel really highlight like we need to consider incentive from both sides, both the businesses and the individuals, how they would react to any reforms, changes in their contracts and job mobility issues. So I think Peter mentioned these, we need to consider different types of jobs. I think in the government review, the government is also interested in like whether we should consider reforms based on different types of industries or seniorities of the job positions. So what's the panel's view on this? Do you think the government should take a more targeted approach considering the differences in different types of jobs?
I saw that in the paper as well, and it's probably more palatable to employers and the to have a selective approach concerning income thresholds, industry types, and so forth that might be able to disaggregate rather than a blanket ban like Joe Biden attempted and probably failed in the US. Yeah, I'm not too sure. It seems that what I find quite interesting is that collectively at the economic level, they're really bad, right? And that the economic system as a whole would be better without them. But individual employers don't think collectively, right? They don't think that way. It's for economists to think that way, and for governments to think that way about the greatest good for the public. And so I think to get employers on board, we need to see the situation from their perspective to a certain extent. They don't think collectively, and to try and figure out how to get them to see the damage to their own organizations, right? Their own productivity and profitability, of which we've just talked about in terms of incentives and motivation and so forth in these organizations. But yeah, no, the selective approach looked pretty interesting. I'm not too sure if Dr. Lee is allowed to divulge what's coming in the next few weeks, but yeah, no, I thought that was interesting.
Yep. Other panels?
So I'm not going to comment on competition policy because it's out of my portfolio. But let me comment on the implications for intellectual property policy and decision making, because that is. I think one thing that's discussed in research on this is to the extent that you remove non-compete as an option, then firms will look for substitute instruments to protect their intellectual property. So that may be non-disclosure agreements. It may also be intellectual property enforcement, and including patents. But of course, and there's some advantages to that in that we have policy levers to influence what can be protected under intellectual property law. So patents protect specific kinds of knowledge, which are inventions that are novel, are non-obvious, that step beyond the normal progress of science and technology. And maybe that's what, is what needs to be protected to really drive business investment. But I think also we need to consider if we reduce the enforceability of non-competes and firms substitute away from them toward the increased use of patents as a mobility constraint, what are the implications for how we design our patent system? Do we need to think about the impact of low-value patents more within that context, in that they may also have competition effects? Do we need to understand, think about the scope of the rights and how that's regulated under law, taking into account the impact of intellectual property rights in the labour market. And luckily we have the tools to do that. We have the data to do it, and it's something that we can do in a really systematic way.
Yeah.
One of the proposals I'd seen was that the Fair Work Act would be used, and just as recently we've had an addition to the Fair Work Act that says pay secrecy clauses are unenforceable, because a clause that tells an employee that they must keep their own pay secret and not tell their colleagues what they're earning has had an influence on gender pay equity problems. How does anybody know whether they're being paid fairly if they can't find out what anybody else earns. Those clauses are now unenforceable, and it's a Fair Work Act provision. Now, the Fair Work Act tends to be an instrument that deals with ordinary workers, people who earn high incomes, and at the moment a high income is considered to be $175,000 a year, tend to be sort of outside the protections. So what I have seen in some of the proposals is that people who are covered by the Fair Work Act, i.e. low to moderate earners, you might have a clause in the Fair Work Act which, like it says, no pay secrecy clauses can be enforceable. It may say restrictive covenants stopping someone from actually going to work somewhere else are unenforceable. It wouldn't mean that they can take patents away with them. They'd still be subject to IP laws. They wouldn't be able to breach copyright. They wouldn't be able to take truly confidential information with them. They could be stopped from doing that, but they couldn't be restrained from resigning and accepting another job. And that would be a way of differentiating the marketplace, because all of those very highly paid high-tech people and the company directors, they'd still be covered by plain vanilla common law contract, but people covered by the Fair Work Act, the ordinary workers who are perhaps other people who've been most abused by these developments, would be relieved. I don't think I'd be wanting to leave it up to what employers thought was a fair thing, because some of these restraints, I was really surprised to learn, reading a paper written by the former president of the Fair Work Commission, Justice Ian Ross, that some of these clauses have become used for seasonal workers picking fruit. Now, they don't, the only reason they're there is because there's a real shortage of seasonal fruit pickers, and the farmers, once they've hired some backpackers, they don't want them taking a higher rate of pay from the neighbouring farm. There's no legitimate interest to be protected there, really, and yet where employers suffer serious labour shortages, they're probably more likely to want to keep these kinds of restraints if they think they are a way of keeping a captive labour supply. So I wouldn't leave it for the employers to decide what they need. I'd be thinking in terms of, you know, what's tolerable in the labour market, and those very elite special areas of the labour market where there really is some kind of innovation that needs to be protected, fine, but maybe not hairdressers, cleaners, fruit pickers. And you might be able to achieve that using industrial legislation rather than competition legislation.
Yeah, so I think Joylyn really pointed out like we need to distinguish different types of workers. And I think a major concern pointed out by the government during the review is the impact on ordinary people, their wages, their ability to leave the current employer to work for a competitor potentially. And there's also research showing, like, for ordinary people, their wages is negatively affected by enforceability of non-compete. But for people in senior positions who are in a better position to negotiate, or in tech industry where they have the bargaining power to negotiate their remuneration, sometimes they can get a higher compensation for agreeing to have non-compete included in the employment contracts. So I think we do need to consider the industry differences, the different types of workers who will be affected by any reforms. If I can just ask another question to Andrew, if you are still online. Is the government still considering the targeted approach to any potential reforms?
I certainly respect your enthusiasm about knowing where we're at. Yes, we're considering all options.
Okay, I may have just asked another question. So I think in Michael's presentation, he mentioned there's lots of research evidence from other countries. So is this international evidence how it's shaping the government's thoughts on potential reforms?
Look, very much so. I mentioned at the outset that we got in touch with Evan Starr and JJ Prescott about their research. I reached out to them as a former academic, and then they connected up with the E61 crew, including Dan Andrews and others, in order to shape that survey. And then, of course, we've been keen devourers of the US research. I really appreciated a range of the ways in which the panel members drew that in. As well as the work that you're doing in Australia. I remember when I first started looking at the issue just a couple of years ago, there was basically nothing that anyone had written on non-competes in Australia. Now we've got this vibrant legal body of evidence, and we've got this really good economic body of evidence. So it's the marrying up of that, the two bodies of evidence that has been really valuable for us. Thinking about the chilling impact, so even an unenforceable non-compete can still have adverse effects. Rigorously thinking through how this might be translated into potential restrictions on non-compete clauses in Australia, and also being aware of both the effect on wages and productivity, which the panel's drawn out so beautifully there. So if you're to ban non-competes for low-wage workers, then that stops the pernicious effect on the wages of yoga instructors, but potentially doesn't tackle the impact on productivity of preventing a tech startup from getting off the ground.
Okay, thank you, Andrew, for that insights. So I may just ask one last question before we open the floor to the audience to ask questions. So how should non-compete agreements be considered as part of a broader strategy from employers' perspective for attracting and keeping talents? Any comments from the panelists? So I think a big concern from the employer is, limiting their option to limiting the use of non-compete agreements potentially can pose a threat to their confidential information. So is there another perspective on this? Because Michael pointed out when you have improve the labor mobility, employers, businesses also benefit because you can attract people and it's a healthy competition, right? So how do you have any comments on, like, from a broader business strategy perspective, how can we attract and retain employees? Are there any other ways to make sure people are productive and have the incentives to work hard without relying on non-compete agreements to limit people's mobility?
Yeah, so I guess from a strategic perspective, companies, firms managers need to make their own assessment of the trade-offs in using non-competes between having the security to invest in worker training, in human capital, in intellectual property, but also in their access to complementary, into outside knowledge. I mean, the research sort of suggests that even at the private level, even at the level of firms, enforceability of non-competes may be to their detriment. So even stepping away from what is socially optimal, businesses may benefit, at least in terms of their innovation performance, from reduction in non-compete enforceability. But there's a bit of a collective action problem that to get there, businesses, you'd need action from multiple businesses deciding that even though their immediate benefit may be harmed in the long run, there may be benefits that outweigh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any other comments?
Well, this may be. In my experience, we talk about the employer and the business, but when it comes to legal disputes, It's actually human beings. And the people often making decisions about whether they'll even enforce a restraint is one of the employees in a business. And they're not necessarily acting in the best interest of the business. They're acting out of their own sense of grievance that an employee who they used to work with is leaving. One of the things we have to be mindful of in the law is that it's all human beings against human beings. It's not actually that the business and the logic of economic efficiency at the business level is often really not part of the equation once you get matters into court. It all becomes a very visceral human contest. And so what we have to do is make sure that our laws don't encourage those kind of contests, that they do in fact require, economic rationality perhaps. I'm not too sure exactly how you do that while you allow the law to be as it is. But I think a lot of the discussion, I'm really interested to hear both your perspectives, because one of the things I keep thinking of is that there's this underlying assumption in this economic rationality argument is that human beings do behave rationally. I haven't seen a lot of that in my profession. And also there's this assumption that it's employers who are investing in talent and they invest. And then, of course, when you're very clever at your job, it's because your employer's been really good to you. I don't even know that that's necessarily true these days. I mean, aren't you all funding your own education at the moment? What employer is actually paying your university fees for you? Are they giving you a lot of work experience, or are they making you work for them for nothing while you're getting work experience? Are they recruiting you because you're a blank slate and they're going to tell you everything, or are they testing your resume to see what you can bring to them? I mean, we make these assumptions that employers are the ones who actually create all the value in our economy. I'm just wondering whether maybe it's not individual human beings who do. We just got to make sure our law reflects that.
That's a really deep question for all of us to consider. So we've discussed a range of issues surrounding non-compete agreements, from the legal landscape of non-compete to the socio-economic impact. So now we can open up the floor and see whether the audience have any questions you want to ask to the panelists. We have a question at the back. I think it takes a few seconds to work. Yeah.
Thank you so much to Dr. Lee and the panel members for such an insightful discussion so far. I just had a particular question about, so far a lot of the discussion is focused around, the use of patents to protect IP and, the degree of substitutability between these and, your more typical and non-compete agreements. And I think that's, a very true and valid point. I just wonder about, how do these IPs, are they particularly focused in some industries and certain occupations compared to others? Because another huge aspect of these non-compete agreements is, non-solicitation of clients and co-workers. And if you want competition and you want new firm entries and startups, then, there's only a finite number of, workforce and other potential clients they have to compete with one another, right? So I'd really interested to hear the legality around and the fairness aspects of that specific aspect of the restraint of trade clauses. Thanks.
Look, yeah, I'd say to the extent that with reduction of non-compete enforceability, there's going to be that firms are going to rely on substitute instruments like legal intellectual property. They only cover certain subject matter. They're used intensively in certain sectors, but not in a prevalent way throughout the economy, and they're designed in that way. And so the strategic question for businesses is, what is really my valuable intellectual property that I need to protect in order to compete effectively? And then from a policy standpoint, it's what types of investments do we want to encourage and promote using what types of instruments? And legal intellectual property is one instrument that is not applicable to all kinds of knowledge, and so that's important to take into consideration.
I'm interested that you mentioned client relationships. I have a very firm view that a business does not own its customers. Customers are also human agents who can make their own decisions about who they'll do business with. So the kind of restraint that you put in place needs to be something that doesn't interfere unreasonably with the freedom of customers to choose who they will have as their service provider, which is why I would say that any restrictive covenant that says you're not allowed to contact the clients should be for a relatively short period of time, the amount of time that it would take the employer to contact their customers and say, Fred is not working with us anymore, pursuing his own interests, but we have an excellent client relationship manager, Jane. She's coming to meet you at your convenience to talk you through how we can continue to service the client needs. Now, that I think is reasonable, but anything beyond that purports to say, I'm a business, I've managed to service these clients in the past, they belong to me. It's just not true. From a legal perspective, only things, intangible or tangible, are property. Human beings are not property and they cannot be owned, certainly not in our, modern Western capitalist economy. So we have to be careful not to slip into the language that the customers and the customer connections belong to the original employer, and even more so, the staff. I've seen cases where staff who didn't sign anything, nevertheless have not been allowed to go to a new job that they thought they'd obtained because the person who offered them the job had signed a contract saying they wouldn't hire anyone. The person now whose prospects are limited didn't even sign anything. So the rationale of contract law that we should enforce people's voluntarily made contracts isn't even present in that scenario. And yet our law is going in the direction of enforcing those. So we have to keep coming back to fundamental principles of our democracy when we allow these creeping changes to our laws. And one of the most important principles is the liberty of the human being to make their own choices.
Any other questions?
Thank you so much. It was very insightful. I was wondering if Australia recognizes the doctrine of inevitable disclosure, and if you think this is a reasonable logic to restrain an employee to work in another company.
So the doctrine of inevitable disclosure, meaning that that's a defence to revealing confidential information. Yeah, well, we do have confidential information is protected in our legal system, and it's protected by an injunction that you don't tell the secret. An injunction that you don't tell the secret. Not an injunction that you don't go to another job because you might tell the secret, just an injunction that you don't tell the secret. There's a defence to a a complaint that you've breached confidential information, and that is that the disclosure was in the public interest. It's fairly narrowly defined, but certainly things like you can't be made to keep a secret that somebody else has broken the law, because you've got a competing legal obligation to report breaches of our laws. So, for instance, if you're working for an employer who's breaching competition laws or insider trading laws, and you disclose that, you haven't breached, you've got a defence to your breach of confidence. So that sounds to me like this doctrine of inevitable disclosure, the disclosure that's required because you have a competing legal obligation. But I haven't heard that particular expression used, inevitable.
Okay, so I'm aware of time. So maybe let me just ask one final question. So I know some of the audience today are UTS students. So any last thoughts, comments from the panel? Any advice you can give to our students who prepare to go into workforce? Any advice in navigating employment relations, or how should they approach non-compete in job offers?
Joining union would be my advice, if you haven't already.
I would say engage in the policy process because it affects your outcomes in the future, and you have a unique opportunity with these competition reforms to voice your interests and to engage in the policy process.
And the last one, just read the employment contract before you sign. Highlight any clauses that deal with these kinds of things. Don't be afraid to politely make inquiries about it. If you get anyone coming back from HR saying, oh, don't worry, we never enforce those, get that statement from them in writing and keep the record of that conversation. Always keep notes of conversations you have about those kinds of things safely aside. Hope that the job works out well for you and that you don't end up in any disputes, but at least if you've kept good file notes of everything that went on at the time of negotiating the contract, you might have some chance of winning an argument when you're leaving.
Very useful feedback. Andrew, any last thoughts, comments?
Well, there's all the wonderful observations that have been made on non-competes. There's nothing I could add to the brilliant insights of the panel, particularly the advice of joining a union. But I do think that sometimes when you're starting off in your career, there is a tendency to stick a little bit too long and not to spend enough time searching. So take a leaf out of the way in which many people work in the dating market and shop around a little. Recognise that in trying out a new job, you're not just learning about that firm, you're also learning about yourself and how well you fit into that environment. I don't think young workers often try enough new environments. Work experience is a fantastic option. So is chatting to friends and mentors. But it is a huge economy with a whole lot of different options out there. And the more time you can spend searching, learning and engaging, the better you are to find a great fit that is going to be a terrific trajectory for you. But look, thanks everyone for a wonderful discussion, and thank you particularly to the panel. We really value in government the intellectual engagement from UTS and from all of you on these issues. It really helps us form better policy. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Andrew. So we've come to the end of today's discussion. So first, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Andrew for joining us today online and delivering the keynote address. And also thank you to all our panelists today for your wonderful, valuable contribution to the discussion, Professor Joellen Matten, Dr. Michael Falk, and Professor Peter Fleming. And also thank you to our audience for your participation today. We hope today's discussion give you a deeper understanding about the complex issues surrounding non-compete agreements and its social economic impact. And we are looking forward to continuing these discussions in the future. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon. Thank you. Thank you.